If you're coming into the world of databases brand new or somewhat new, I want to help you out in this video with just some terminologies that you're going to hear about database objects. And almost any book that you read about Access or anything that you read on Microsoft's site even about their own product can tend to confuse you sometimes about this thing called database objects. Well, notice on the screen here a very simple description of what the database objects are. They are the logical units that collectively all together make up the database. Now, what exactly are we talking about? Well, schema is the word that you will hear database nerds use to talk about the database objects. The schema is the term that's used to describe this collection of database objects. And so whenever someone mentions the schema of the database, what they're talking about are the number of tables, how those tables relate to each other, the data types within those tables. In other words, the structure. If you were to think of a house, it would be the 2x4s, all the lumber that's nailed up before they begin to apply sheetrock or whatever wall coverings they do and floor coverings and so forth. So it's the frame or the body, if you will, of the database. Now the database objects perform various functions. And that term object sounds very programmer-ish or something like that, if that's a word. And don't let it throw you. What they're talking about are, for example, objects that actually store the data, and that would be tables. And in some places in documentation that you look at, tables will be referred to as entities. And then within the tables there are individual fields, and you'll hear those referred to as columns and vice versa. And some people, depending on what level of database design you're working at, will refer to the individual columns or fields in the tables as database objects, because really they are. The indexes on some of those columns are objects within the database. Now let's continue here. Objects that reference the data are, again, objects that we will hear about, and different database objects will refer to the queries as database objects, and even the relationships between the tables, because every one of these things are constructs that we will build, that have properties that we will maintain, that we will delete, that we will edit. So almost anything that you work with within the database is an object. Now something else that's kind of interesting, and we will touch on this in a totally separate video about Access, where we will talk about Access database objects. Because in that video called Access Database Objects, I will talk about the way Microsoft refers to objects within the Access environment. And this can be very different. Don't let it throw you when you get out there in the real world. Oracle people will talk about database objects, and they will consider different granular levels of the objects as what they call, quote, objects. Same thing in SQL Server, same thing in other database worlds, okay? So as far as Access is concerned, there are 6 major database objects, and we'll look at those in a separate video cleverly entitled Access Database Objects. But I wanted you to understand these terminologies that you're going to hear and you're going to read about when you're out there trying to get your head around this whole database thing, okay? So just because you don't see it mentioned here, or it's mentioned a little bit differently, doesn't mean it's wrong. It just kind of means you're kind of in a different little neighborhood, and they're using just a little bit different nomenclature to name the very same or similar type functionalities.